The lantern glass cracked against Clara Thorne's saddlebag with every stride of her horse. She had been riding for nearly 2 hours through the back roads of Oakhaven, her medical satchel strapped tight across her chest, her wool cloak soaked through from the mist rolling off the river. The delivery had taken longer than expected. Old Mrs. Pemberton's fever had climbed so high that Clara had stayed an extra hour, pressing cool cloths to the woman's forehead and mixing a fresh tincture of willow bark and dried chamomile until the shaking finally stopped. Now, past midnight, the countryside was a wall of black. The only light came from a half-moon that appeared and disappeared behind slow-moving clouds. Clara knew this stretch of road better than most. She had ridden it dozens of times over the past 3 years, ever since she had taken up the position of assistant to Mr. Hargrove, the village apothecary. The road curved east along the river, crossed the old stone arch they called River Mist Bridge, and then wound down into the valley toward the village. She slowed her horse as the bridge came into view. Something felt wrong. It was the sound first, a low, grinding noise, like 2 heavy stones shifting against each other. Clara pulled back on the reins and brought her mare to a full stop about 30 yards from the bridge entrance. The mist was thicker here, curling up from the water below and settling across the stone railing like a white curtain. She squinted hard. The bridge was old, built more than a century ago, wide enough for a single carriage and lined with thick stone walls on both sides. She had crossed it hundreds of times without a second thought, but tonight, something was different. Clara climbed down from her saddle, tied the reins to a low branch, and walked closer on foot. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel as she approached the arch. She held up her lantern, and the orange glow fell across the left side of the bridge wall. What she saw made her stomach drop. 3 of the keystones along the base of the arch had been pulled loose. They weren't cracked from age or weather. The edges were clean, scraped with tool marks. Someone had pried them out deliberately, and the remaining stones had shifted under the weight. A thick fracture now ran diagonally through the center of the arch, splitting the load-bearing wall nearly in half. The bridge was still standing, but barely. 1 heavy carriage rolling across would send the whole structure into the river 20 feet below. Clara pressed her palm against the stone. It moved under her touch. She stepped back quickly, her heart hammering. This was sabotage. Calculated, deliberate sabotage. She looked down the road behind her. Empty. She looked ahead, past the bridge, into the darkness on the other side. Also empty. Whoever had done this was already gone. The question was, who were they trying to kill? And then she heard it. Hooves, wheels, the unmistakable rhythm of a carriage approaching fast from the far side of the bridge. Clara's breath caught. The carriage was coming from the north road, which meant whoever was inside would cross the bridge from the opposite end without any idea what waited in the middle. She had maybe 40 seconds. Clara grabbed her lantern, sprinted back to her horse, and swung herself into the saddle. She kicked hard, and the mare surged forward, galloping straight toward the far end of the bridge. She couldn't cross it safely on horseback, so she rode along the riverbank, crashing through low bushes and wet grass until she found the shallow ford 50 yards downstream. The water came up to the horse's knees as they splashed across in the dark. And then Clara was climbing the opposite bank, mud flying from the hooves, racing toward the road on the other side. The carriage lanterns came into view. 2 yellow dots bouncing in the darkness, growing larger every second. Clara pulled her horse sideways across the road and held her lantern high above her head, swinging it back and forth. "Stop!" she screamed into the night. "Stop the carriage! The bridge is out!" The driver saw her at the last moment. He hauled back on the reins with both hands, and the 2 horses pulling the carriage reared up with a terrible sound. The wooden wheels locked and skidded across the wet gravel, and the whole carriage lurched sideways before grinding to a halt barely 15 feet from the bridge entrance. One of the front wheels cracked against a stone marker and split at the rim. For a long moment, the only sounds were the panting of the horses and the dripping of water from the trees. Then the carriage door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, lean, dressed in a plain, dark traveling cloak with the collar turned up against the cold. His boots were well made, but worn from long use. He carried no visible weapon, no crest, no signet ring. He looked like any ordinary gentleman returning from a long journey. His face was sharp-featured and serious, with deep-set eyes that studied Clara with calm intensity, even in the dim lantern light. "You nearly gave my driver a heart attack," he said quietly. His voice was steady, almost unnervingly so for a man who had just been seconds from plunging into a river. "And you were seconds from dying, sir," Clara replied, still catching her breath. "The bridge has been tampered with. The keystones on the south arch have been removed. The whole thing will collapse under any real weight." The man's expression changed. The calm didn't leave his face, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He walked past Clara without another word, took her lantern from her hand gently, and strode to the bridge entrance. He crouched low, holding the light close to the fractured stones. His fingers traced the tool marks along the edges of the missing keystones. He stayed like that for a long time. When he stood up and turned back toward her, the look on his face was different. It was the look of a man who had just confirmed something he had been afraid of. "These weren't removed by weather or neglect," he said. "I know," Clara replied. "Someone pried them out. The marks are fresh. Whoever did this knew exactly which stones to pull to weaken the arch without bringing it down immediately." The man stared at her. "You understand stonework?" "I understand patterns, sir. I keep ledgers for an apothecary. You learn to notice what doesn't fit." He looked back at the bridge one more time, then down at the dark water below. When he spoke again, his voice was so low, Clara almost didn't hear it. "They knew I was coming tonight. They knew which road I'd take." Clara felt a cold that had nothing to do with the mist. "Who are you?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He handed the lantern back to her and glanced at the damaged carriage wheel behind them. The driver was already climbing down to inspect it, muttering under his breath. "We aren't going anywhere in that carriage tonight," the man said. "Is there shelter nearby, somewhere off the main road?" Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her she had already done enough. She had saved a stranger's life. She owed him nothing more. But the look in his eyes was one she recognized. She had seen it on patients who came to Mr. Hargrove's shop in the middle of the night. People who were being hunted. People who were running out of time. "There's an old flour mill about 2 miles north," she said. "It hasn't been used in years. We can reach it on horseback." The stranger nodded once. "Then lead the way, Miss—" "Thorne," she said. "Clara Thorne." He extended his hand. "I owe you my life, Miss Thorne, and before this night is over, I suspect I'll owe you a great deal more." They rode into the darkness together, the broken bridge standing silent behind them, and somewhere across the valley, a light flickered in the upper window of a great estate, where someone was waiting for news of a death that hadn't come. The flour mill sat at the end of a narrow path choked with overgrown brambles and fallen branches. Its wooden water wheel had long since stopped turning, and the stone walls were thick with ivy that had crept through every crack over the years. Clara dismounted first and pushed open the heavy door with her shoulder. Inside, the air smelled of damp grain and dust, but the roof was solid, and the floor was dry enough. A few broken sacks of old flour lay piled in the corner beside a rusted iron stove. The stranger's driver, a quiet older man named Finch, led the horses around the back, where a collapsed hay shelter still offered some cover from the mist. Clara found a stack of dry kindling near the stove and struck a match from her medical kit. Within minutes, a small fire crackled inside the iron belly of the stove, throwing orange light across the mill's interior. The stranger sat down on an upturned crate near the fire. He hadn't spoken much during the ride. His eyes had been scanning the tree line the entire way, watching for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the night. Clara poured water from her canteen into a tin cup and handed it to him. He took it with a short nod of thanks. She sat across from him on a second crate and waited. She had learned patience from years of working beside Mr. Hargrove.
People talked when they were ready, and pushing too early only made them shut their mouths tighter. After a long silence, the man set down the cup and looked at her directly. "My name is Julian Ashworth," he said. 10 years ago, I was the heir to the Vane estate. The lands, the manor, the tenancies, the harbor rights along this stretch of the river. All of it belonged to my father, Lord Edmund Ashworth. When he died, the title and the estate should have passed to me. Clara said nothing. She kept her hands still in her lap and let him continue. I was 21 when my father passed. I had been away at university in Edinburgh, studying estate law and land management. By the time I received the letter and made the journey south, my cousin Malachi had already moved into the manor. He presented the local magistrate with a deed of inheritance, signed and sealed, naming himself as the sole beneficiary of my father's estate. "And the deed was a forgery," Clara said. Julian looked at her with a trace of surprise. "You say that with a great deal of certainty for someone who just learned my name." Clara reached into a satchel and pulled out a folded piece of parchment she had noticed tucked into the inner lining of the carriage seat when she had helped Finch retrieve the luggage. She held it up near the lantern so the light passed through the paper. "I noticed this when we were unloading the bags. Look at the watermark. Do you see those 2 crossed anchors with the chain running through them?" Julian leaned forward. "That's the mark of the original carriage registration. It came with the vehicle when my father purchased it years ago."
"That's what I thought," Clara said. "But this particular watermark, the crossed anchors with the chain loop at the top, is produced by only one paper mill in this part of England. It's a specialty parchment made at Whitley & Sons in the port city of High Point. I know because Mr. Hargrove orders his prescription ledger paper from the same mill. They use a very specific linen and cotton blend that holds ink without bleeding, and their watermark is registered with the High Point Trade Guild." She set the paper down between them. "If your cousin's forged deed was written on parchment from the same source,
Then the proof of where and how he obtained the materials for the forgery starts in High Point."
Julian stared at the watermark for a long time. When he finally looked up, something had changed behind his expression. The guarded distance that had been sitting in his face since the bridge began to soften. "For 10 years, he said quietly, I've carried nothing but a few old documents, a claim that every solicitor in London told me I could never prove, and a name that my own cousin erased from the county records. I came back tonight because I received word through a trusted friend that Malachi is preparing to sell portions of the estate to a railway surveyor. Once those contracts are signed, the land transfers become irreversible. I have days at most." "Then sitting in this mill won't help you," Clara said. "No," Julian agreed. "It won't." He paused, turning the parchment over in his hands. "Miss Thorne, I have no right to ask you for anything further. You've already saved my life once tonight. But I need someone who understands documents, paper trails, and record-keeping. Someone who can walk into a public archive without raising suspicion. I can't show my face in High Point without Malachi's people recognizing me within the hour." Clara considered this. She thought about Mr. Hargrove, who would expect her at the shop by 9 in the morning. She thought about old Mrs. Pemberton, who would need a second visit by tomorrow evening. She thought about her small rented room above the bakery in the village, with its narrow bed and its shelf of dried herbs and its single window that looked out over the church steeple. And then she thought about the bridge. Those clean tool marks on the keystones, the precision of it. Whoever had ordered that sabotage hadn't just wanted Julian gone. They had wanted it to look like an accident, a tragic collapse on an old bridge in the middle of the night. No witnesses, no questions, no investigation. Just another traveler lost to bad luck and crumbling infrastructure. That kind of planning required resources, influence, and a complete absence of conscience.
"I'll need to send word to Mr. Hargrove that I've been called away on a medical matter," Clara said.
Finch can deliver the message when he takes the horses to the farrier for new shoes. The morning stagecoach to High Point departs from the Crossroads Inn at 7:30. If we leave here before dawn, we can make it.
Julian studied her face in the firelight. "You understand what you're agreeing to. Malachi has men watching the roads. If he discovers that someone is helping me gather evidence against him, he will come after you as well." Clara folded the parchment neatly and tucked it back into her satchel.
"Then we'd better make sure he doesn't discover it until it's too late."
Outside, the first gray edge of dawn was beginning to show above the eastern hills. Finch appeared in the doorway, brushing hay from his sleeves, and reported that the horses were fed and rested enough for a short ride. Julian stood, adjusted his cloak, and extended his hand to Clara once more.
"Partners, then," he said. Clara shook it firmly. "Partners."
They left the mill before the sun cleared the ridge, walking the horses quietly along the back trails toward the Crossroads Inn, while somewhere behind them, in the great manor on the hill, Malachi Ashworth was receiving the unwelcome news that no carriage had been found at the bottom of the river. The Crossroads Inn was a squat, timber-framed building with a thatched roof and a hand-painted sign that read, "The Barley Sheaf," in faded gold letters. By the time Clara and Julian arrived on foot, leading the horses behind them, a handful of early travelers had already gathered near the front entrance, stamping their boots against the morning chill and clutching parcels under their arms. Clara spotted the stagecoach immediately. It was a weathered, brown, four-horse coach operated by the High Point and District Passenger Line, and the driver was already loading luggage onto the rear rack.
A chalkboard propped beside the mounting step listed the route:
Oakhaven Crossroads to High Point, 6 hours, with a brief stop at the market town of Dunbury for a change of horses. Julian hung back near the stone wall at the edge of the inn yard. He had pulled the collar of his cloak high and kept his head angled away from the road. Clara understood why. If Malachi's men had already discovered the empty bridge and the abandoned carriage, they would be checking every public departure point within a 10-mile stretch by now.
"Stay here," Clara said. "I'll purchase the tickets."
She crossed the yard and approached the coach office window, a small hatch cut into the side of the inn wall, where a stout woman in a linen cap was selling passage and counting coins into a wooden tray.
"2 seats to High Point, please," Clara said. "Inside the coach."
The woman glanced up.
"Names for the register?"
Clara didn't hesitate.
"Miss C. Hargrove and Mr. J. Finch."
The woman wrote the names down without a second look, collected the fare, and handed over 2 printed tickets. Clara tucked them into her satchel and walked back to Julian. "You used your employer's name," he said quietly, "and your driver's. Anyone searching the passenger log for Julian Ashworth or Clara Thorne will find nothing." Julian allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "You've done this sort of thing before?" "I've helped Mr. Hargrove manage difficult customers who preferred their prescriptions kept out of public knowledge. Discretion becomes a habit after a while." They boarded the coach separately. Clara climbed in first and took a seat near the far window. Julian followed 2 minutes later, settling into the opposite corner with a folded newspaper he had taken from the inn's front table. 2 other passengers joined them shortly after. A gray-haired clergyman carrying a leather Bible and a young woman with a hatbox balanced on her knees. Neither paid Clara or Julian any particular attention. The coach lurched forward at 7:30, and within minutes, the Crossroads Inn had disappeared behind a line of elm trees. Clara watched the road through the window as the coach rattled south along the main turnpike. The countryside here was wide and green, dotted with sheep pastures and low stone walls. Every few miles, they passed a farmstead or a cluster of cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys. Julian kept his eyes on the newspaper, though Clara could tell he wasn't reading it. His gaze moved to the window every time the coach slowed or another vehicle passed on the road. About an hour into the journey, a pair of riders overtook the coach at a fast trot. Julian's hand tightened on the edge of the newspaper. Clara watched the riders through the glass.
They wore dark riding coats and sat their horses with the stiff posture of hired men,
the kind of men estates employed for enforcement work rather than farming. The riders passed without stopping. Julian exhaled slowly.
Malachi's?
Clara asked under her breath. Possibly. He keeps a rotation of outriders who patrol the roads between the estate and the county border. If they were looking for someone specific, they would have flagged the coach down.
Then they're still searching blind, Clara said. That gives us a few hours at most.
The clergyman across from them had fallen asleep with his chin on his chest. The young woman with the hat box was gazing out her own window with a dreamy expression. Clara leaned slightly toward Julian and lowered her voice further.
"Tell me about the High Point archives. What exactly are we looking for?"
Julian folded the newspaper and set it on his knee. When my father died, the estate transfer should have been recorded through the county land office here in Oakhaven. But Malachi didn't file through the local office. He registered the deed directly with the Maritime Vaults in High Point, which handles property records for the entire coastal district. It was a clever move. The Maritime Vaults process hundreds of filings each month. A single estate transfer from a rural parish would have attracted almost no scrutiny.
"So the original filing is still there," Clara said.
"It should be. Every deed registered with the vaults is accompanied by a witness declaration and a notary seal. If the witnesses were fabricated and the notary was absent at the time of signing, those details will be recorded in the surrounding documents. Shipping logs, harbor departure records, anything that proves the notary couldn't have been present on the date the deed was stamped." Clara reached into her satchel and pulled out a small leather notebook she used for recording prescription ingredients and delivery schedules. She opened it to a blank page and began writing in a tight, precise hand.
"The Maritime Vaults keep their registry books sorted by year and parish. If the deed was filed 10 years ago, we need access to the 1833 records for Oakhaven Parish. The witness declaration will be in the same ledger or a companion volume kept in the same shelf block, and the harbor departure logs should be in the maritime section on the lower floor." Julian watched her write.
"You know the layout of the vaults? I've placed orders through the High Point Trade Office twice a year for Mr. Hargrove's imported supplies. The trade office shares a building with the public records section of the vaults. I've walked past those shelves a dozen times."
She tore the page from the notebook and handed it to him. On it, she had sketched a rough floor plan showing the entrance hall, the public records room, the maritime registry section below, and the clerk's desk that separated the accessible shelves from the restricted archives behind a locked iron gate.
"The restricted section is where the original witness declarations are kept," Clara said. "We can't access that directly. But the public registry on the main floor will have the index entries that reference those declarations. If we can match the filing number and the date, we'll know exactly which documents to request through formal channels, or which ones to look for if formal channels aren't available to us."
Julian studied the sketch carefully, then folded it and placed it inside his coat. The coach hit a rut in the road and rocked sideways. The clergyman snorted in his sleep but didn't wake.
"Miss Thorne," Julian said,
"I came back to England expecting to fight this battle alone. I thought I would be knocking on doors and begging solicitors to hear my case for the 100th time. Instead, I find myself sitting in a stagecoach with an apothecary's assistant who reads watermarks, draws floor plans from memory, and books travel under false names without blinking." Clara closed her notebook and returned it to her satchel. "And I expected to spend this week restocking dried lavender and measuring tincture bottles. Yet here we are." The coach rolled on through the midday sun toward High Point, and behind them, the distance between Clara Thorne's quiet village life and the trouble she had ridden into grew wider with every passing mile. High Point announced itself long before the coach reached its gates, The smell of salt water and tar drifted through the windows first, followed by the distant cries of gulls wheeling above the harbor masts. Then the road widened, the hedgerows gave way to brick walls, and the countryside dissolved into a dense sprawl of warehouses, chandleries, and narrow streets packed with carts and pedestrians. The stagecoach pulled into the depot yard at 1:30 in the afternoon. Clara stepped down first, adjusting her satchel strap and scanning the busy street. High Point was a working port city, loud and crowded, full of sailors, merchants, clerks, and dock workers moving between the wharves and the commercial district. The air tasted of brine and coal smoke, perfect for two people who needed to disappear into a crowd. Julian descended after her, keeping his cloak drawn and his movements unhurried. They walked together through the depot yard and turned east along Chandler Street toward the civic quarter where the maritime vaults were housed. The vaults occupied the ground and basement floors of a large Georgian building faced with Portland stone. The upper floors belonged to the High Point Harbor Authority, and the entrance was shared with the Trade Licensing Office, which meant a steady stream of ordinary people passed through the front doors throughout the day. Merchants filing cargo manifests, ship captains registering crew lists, traders collecting import certificates. Two more visitors would draw no special attention. Clara led Julian through the main entrance into a wide hall lined with wooden benches and glass-fronted notice boards. The floor was polished marble, and a long oak counter ran across the far end of the room, where three clerks sat on high stools, processing paperwork. "Wait near the reading tables," Clara said quietly. "Let me handle the clerk." Julian moved to a table in the far corner and sat down with his back to the counter, pulling a broadsheet from the rack on the wall as cover. Clara approached the nearest clerk, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers.
"Good afternoon,"
she said, placing her hands on the counter.
"My name is Miss Hargrove. I'm the ledger assistant to Mr. Hargrove, the licensed apothecary in Oakhaven Parish. I need to consult the Public Land Registry for 1833 regarding a property boundary question that's come up in connection with one of our supplier contracts."
The clerk peered at her over his spectacles. "You have a professional credential?" Clara produced a folded letter from her satchel. It was the annual supply authorization that Mr. Hargrove had signed for her last autumn, granting her permission to conduct business on his behalf at the High Point Trade Office. The clerk examined the signature and the apothecary guild stamp at the bottom, then handed it back with a satisfied nod. "The 1833 parish registries are in the second alcove on the left. You may consult the index volumes on the open shelves. If you require specific filings from the restricted archive, you'll need to submit a written request at the end counter and allow 2 working days for retrieval."
"Thank you," Clara said. "I shouldn't need more than the index volumes today."
She walked to the second alcove and found Julian already there, having moved from the reading table the moment the clerk had turned his attention to the next visitor. The alcove was a quiet, dim space, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound registry volumes arranged by year and parish. A narrow window at the top of the wall let in a gray stripe of afternoon light. Clara ran her finger along the spines until she found the volume marked 1833, Oakhaven Parish, Land Transfers and Estate Filings. She pulled it down carefully and laid it open on the small wooden desk built into the alcove wall. The entries were written in a precise clerical hand, each one recording the date, the nature of the filing, the names of the parties involved, and the reference numbers for the accompanying witness declarations and notary seals stored in the restricted archive behind the iron gate. Julian stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. His finger stopped on an entry near the bottom of the 43rd page. "There," he said. The entry read, 14th June, 1833, transfer of estate and title, Vane Manor and all associated holdings, Oakhaven Parish, filed by Mr. Malachi Ashworth, claimant, witnessed by Mr. George Tull and Mr. Reginald Fenton, notarized by Mr. Albert Cross, licensed notary, High Point District. Clara copied the reference numbers onto a fresh page of her notebook, then turned to Julian.
George Tull and Reginald Fenton. Do you know those names?
I've never heard of either one, Julian said.
And that is precisely the problem. My father knew every landowner, solicitor, and professional within 30 miles of Oakhaven. If these men were legitimate witnesses to an estate transfer of this size, their names would appear in other local records. Parish council minutes, trade guild rosters, something.
Then let's find out if they exist at all, Clara said. She moved to the next shelf block, which held the High Point resident directories for the surrounding years. She pulled the 1832 and 1834 volumes and began cross-referencing. Julian took the 1833 directory and did the same. After 20 minutes of careful searching, they had their answer. Neither George Tull nor Reginald Fenton appeared in any High Point resident directory, voter roll, or trade guild register for any year between 1830 and 1836.
Invented names, Clara said. Malachi created 2 witnesses out of thin air.
Julian's jaw tightened. And the notary. Albert Cross. I know that name. He was a real man, a licensed notary who operated out of High Point for decades. Malachi would have needed a genuine notary stamp to make the filing pass inspection. Clara was already moving. She crossed the hall to the Maritime Registry section on the lower floor, accessible through a short staircase near the back wall. Julian followed. The Maritime section was quieter, occupied by a single elderly clerk dozing at a corner desk. The harbor departure logs were arranged by month along a low shelf near the entrance. Clara pulled the June 1833 volume and opened it across her knees, flipping to the 14th. Her finger traced down the list of vessels that had cleared High Point Harbor that day. And there it was. The merchant vessel Cormorant departed High Point Harbor on the morning of June 13, 1833, bound for Lisbon. Listed among the registered passengers was Mr. Albert Cross, licensed notary, traveling on commercial business. The ship's return was logged as July 9th, nearly 4 weeks later. Clara held the page open for Julian to read. His face went still. Albert Cross had been at sea on the day he supposedly notarized Malachi's deed. He was physically absent from High Point, somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean, when his stamp was pressed onto the document that stole Julian's inheritance.
Someone used his seal without his knowledge, Julian said.
Or Malachi obtained a duplicate.
Clara copied the ship's departure record into her notebook, then added the name of the filing clerk listed at the bottom of the original land transfer entry. A Mr. Harold Sefton, junior clerk, Maritime Vaults. The man who had processed Malachi's paperwork and accepted 2 fictitious witnesses and an impossible notary signature without raising a single question. She closed the logbook and returned it to the shelf. We have the filing date, the fake witnesses, and proof the notary was out of the country. That's enough to build a challenge, but it's all circumstantial, unless we can find the physical evidence that ties Malachi to the forgery itself. Julian nodded slowly. The brass seal mold. If Malachi had a duplicate stamp made to forge the notary mark, he would have kept it somewhere secure. Somewhere private.
Somewhere like a locked room inside his own manor, Clara said.
They climbed the stairs back to the main hall, returned the registry volumes to their places, and walked out through the front entrance into the grey High Point afternoon, without the clerk ever glancing up from his paperwork. The merchant quarter of High Point occupied a tangle of narrow streets behind the main harbor road, where tall brick buildings leaned toward each other across cobblestone lanes barely wide enough for a handcart. The ground floors were given over to trade shops, selling everything from imported silk to dried tobacco, and the upper stories housed the cramped living quarters of clerks, sailors between voyages, and small traders who couldn't afford premises closer to the waterfront. Clara knew one address in particular, a spice shop on Marden Lane, run by a woman named Mrs. Adela Birch, who supplied Mr. Hargrove with his imported medicinal spices twice a year.
Clara had stayed in the room above the shop on 2 previous occasions when weather or late business had prevented her from catching the evening coach back to Oakhaven. Mrs. Birch was a widow in her 60s, sharp-eyed and practical, and she had a firm policy of minding her own affairs while expecting her guests to do the same. They reached Marden Lane as the church bells struck 4. Clara knocked at the side door while Julian waited a few steps behind, keeping his face turned toward the wall. Mrs. Birch opened the door, took one look at Clara, and stepped aside without a word.
"I need the upstairs room for the night, Mrs. Birch. Possibly 2 nights. My companion is a business associate of Mr. Hargrove's."
Mrs. Birch glanced past Clara at Julian's back. "He can sleep in the storeroom behind the shop. There's a cot and a washstand. The upstairs room is yours as usual."
"That will do perfectly, thank you."
Mrs. Birch produced a key from her apron pocket, handed it to Clara, and disappeared back into the shop without asking a single question. The scent of cinnamon, clove, and dried ginger followed her through the doorway like a warm cloud. Clara and Julian settled into their separate quarters. The upstairs room was small and plain, with a single bed, a writing desk, a wooden chair, and a window that overlooked the narrow lane below. Clara set her satchel on the desk and spread out the notes she had taken at the maritime vaults. Julian appeared at her doorway 10 minutes later, carrying the parchment document from the carriage. "I managed to take something else from the vaults," he said. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded square of heavy paper, slightly larger than his palm. Clara recognized the wax impression immediately. It was a duplicate of the notary seal pressed onto Malachi's estate filing, lifted carefully from the registry book's margin where a second impression had been stamped as a verification mark. "You took that while I was checking the harbor logs," Clara said. "The clerk was asleep. The wax was loose at the edges. It came away cleanly." He set the seal impression on the desk beside Clara's notes. "Can you do anything with it?" Clara opened her medical satchel and began removing small glass bottles from the padded interior. As an apothecary's assistant, she carried a selection of chemical reagents used for testing the purity of medicines, identifying plant extracts, and verifying the composition of imported compounds. Several of these reagents were also useful for examining inks, dyes, and metalwork impressions. She selected a bottle of diluted iron gall solution and a second bottle of tannic acid wash. She poured a small measure of each into separate saucers borrowed from Mrs. Birch's kitchen, then held the wax seal impression under the lamp and examined it with a magnifying lens she kept in her kit for reading fine print prescription labels. "Look at this," she said after several minutes. Julian pulled a chair beside her and leaned in. "A proper notary seal is cast from a single piece of brass using a licensed mold registered with the county seal office. The impression should be uniform in depth and perfectly symmetrical. Every licensed notary in England has his mold inspected once a year by the county registrar to ensure consistency." She dipped a thin brush into the iron gall solution and applied it gently across the surface of the wax impression. The chemical reacted with the trace metals embedded in the wax from the original brass stamp, darkening certain areas and leaving others untouched. A pattern emerged. "Here," Clara said, pointing with the tip of the brush. "Do you see this line running along the inner border of the seal? It's a ridge, a casting floor. In a properly manufactured mold, this ridge wouldn't exist, but if someone took a licensed seal, pressed it into clay to create a secondary mold, and then cast a new brass stamp from that clay impression, you'd get exactly this kind of imperfection. The ridge forms where the clay didn't capture the fine detail of the original." Julian stared at the darkened line. So this seal wasn't stamped by the real notary's mold. "It was stamped by a copy, a very good copy, good enough to fool a clerk processing hundreds of documents in a week. But the casting floor is there, and it's consistent across the entire border, which means the duplicate mold itself still exists somewhere. If we find the mold, we can match it to this impression exactly." And that's physical evidence no magistrate could dismiss. Julian sat back in the chair and rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. "Malachi is careful. He wouldn't leave something like that lying around in an obvious place.
Where would he keep his most private documents and valuables? Clara asked.
The Grand Library, Julian said without hesitation. My father had a wall safe built behind the family portrait above the fireplace. It was designed by a locksmith from London and fitted with a hidden spring mechanism. Malachi would have inherited the safe along with everything else. If he's storing evidence of his own fraud, that's where it would be. Clara made a note in her book and then turned the wax impression over, applying the tannic acid wash to the reverse side. Another detail appeared, a faint maker's mark pressed into the edge of the wax, so small it was nearly invisible to the bare eye. She held the magnifying lens over it and read the letters aloud.
W&S, Whitley & Sons.
The same paper mill that produced the parchment, Julian said. Whitley & Sons doesn't just make paper. They also manufacture specialty wax for official seals and correspondence. Malachi sourced everything for his forgery from the same supplier here in High Point. The paper, the sealing wax, probably the clay for the duplicate mold as well. He built the entire fraud in this city, then filed it through the maritime vaults where nobody would examine it closely. Clara sealed the wax impression inside a small linen pouch from her kit and placed it in the bottom of her satchel alongside the parchment and her notebook. 3 pieces of a puzzle that had been buried for 10 years, now sitting in a canvas bag in a room above a spice shop. Julian stood and walked to the window. The lane below was growing dark as the afternoon faded into evening. Lamplighters were making their rounds, and the sound of the harbor bells carried faintly through the glass.
We need to get inside that library, he said.
Then we need to get inside the manor, Clara replied. And I think I know a way.
They left High Point before dawn the following morning, catching a ride on a farmer's cart heading north toward the market town of Dunbury. From there, they hired a small 2-wheeled gig from a livery stable and drove themselves along the back lanes that ran parallel to the main Oakhaven Road. Julian handled the reins, while Clara sat beside him with a folded ordnance map spread across her knees, tracing the network of paths and farm tracks that approached Vane Manor from the east. The countryside changed as they drew closer to the estate. The open sheep pastures gave way to dense woodland, and the road narrowed until it was little more than a dirt track winding between old oaks and thick hedgerows. By midday, they had reached a secluded stretch of coastal cliff path that offered a clear view of the Vane estate below.
Julian pulled the gig off the track and secured the horse to a fallen tree.
They walked to the cliff edge and crouched behind a line of gorse bushes. From here, the manor spread out beneath them like a drawing in a country journal. Vane Manor was a handsome Jacobean house built from honey-colored stone with tall chimneys, mullioned windows, and a central courtyard enclosed by a low wall. The main approach was a gravel drive lined with lime trees, leading from the public road through a pair of iron gates to the front entrance. Beyond the house, the grounds extended south toward the river and east toward a block of formal gardens, glass houses, and a walled kitchen garden that backed onto the edge of the woodland. Julian pointed toward the main gates. There, 2 men at the gatehouse, and at least 1 more walking the perimeter of the front courtyard. Clara could see them clearly. The gatehouse guards wore plain dark coats and carried wooden truncheons at their belts. They weren't livery servants or estate workers. They were hired men, the same sort of private enforcers she had seen riding the roads during their coach journey. How many does Malachi keep on the grounds? She asked. When I last had reports from my contact, he employed 6. 2 at the gates, 2 patrolling the main house corridors at night, and 2 more who rotate between the stables and the service yard. The household staff are separate. A butler, a cook, 3 maids, and a groundskeeper. Most of them have been with the estate since my father's time. Would any of the staff recognize you? Julian hesitated. Possibly. The butler, Mr. Cavendish, served my father for 20 years, but I haven't seen him since I was 21. I was thinner then, clean-shaven, dressed like a university student. 10 years and a beard have changed my appearance enough that a passing glance wouldn't give me away. A conversation might. Clara studied the layout of the grounds through the gorse. The main gates and the front courtyard were heavily watched. The stables and service yard on the west side had regular patrols. Any approach from the south meant crossing open lawn visible from the upper windows. The east side, however, was a different matter. The formal gardens on the eastern edge of the property were enclosed by a high brick wall covered in climbing roses and old ivy. Behind the wall, Clara could see the peaked glass roofs of 2 large glass houses and the top of a stone potting shed. Beyond that, the walled kitchen garden backed directly onto the woodland where they were now hiding. "Tell me about the east gardens," Clara said. Julian shifted his weight and peered through the bushes. "My mother designed them. She was passionate about medicinal plants and rare botanicals. She had the 2 glass houses built specifically for growing specimens that couldn't survive the English winters. After she died, my father maintained them as they were. Whether Malachi has kept them up, I couldn't say." "And the connection to the main house?" "There's a delivery hatch at the back of the kitchen garden wall. It was originally built for receiving coal and firewood during the winter months. A stone ramp leads down from the hatch into the old servant cellars beneath the east wing. From the cellars, a service corridor runs the full length of the house to the main staircase near the library." Clara had already suspected as much. She had noticed the cellar ventilation grates set into the base of the east wall during her survey from the cliff. In older country houses of this period, the servant quarters and storage cellars formed a complete underground network that connected every major room in the house. Builders designed them so that coal, food, and laundry could be moved through the house without passing through the family's living spaces. If the delivery hatch in the kitchen garden was still functional, it offered a direct route into the manor that bypassed every guard post and every watched entrance.
"The hatch," Clara said. "Is it locked?"
"It was never locked in my father's time. It was too heavy for anyone to move without knowing the counterweight lever hidden behind the potting shed wall. The lever releases a pin that allows the hatch cover to swing open. Without it, the cover sits flush with the ground and looks like an ordinary flagstone." Clara noted this in her book.
"And the glasshouse pathways? Can we reach the kitchen garden from the woodland without crossing any open ground?"
Julian nodded. "The garden wall has a service gate on the northeast corner, hidden behind the old compost enclosure. It was used by the groundskeeper to bring in wheelbarrows of mulch from the woods. If the gate hasn't been bricked up, it opens directly into the glasshouse passage, which runs between the 2 conservatories, straight to the kitchen garden." Clara sketched the route in her notebook. Woodland to the service gate, through the glasshouse passage, into the kitchen garden. Locate the counterweight lever behind the potting shed. Open the delivery hatch. Descend into the servant cellars. Follow the service corridor to the main staircase. Climb to the grand library on the first floor. Once inside the house, we'll need to split up, Clara said. You know the location of the safe in the library. I don't. But someone needs to secure keys to the upper floors in case the internal doors have been locked for the night. The butler's pantry, Julian said. Ground floor, just off the service corridor. Mr. Cavendish kept every household key on a ring inside the top drawer of the oak dresser. It was his system for 30 years. Even if Malachi replaced him, the dresser and the keys are almost certainly still there. Clara closed the notebook and looked at the sky. The afternoon clouds were thickening from the west, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. By nightfall, the grounds would be soaked, the visibility poor, and the sound of their footsteps masked by water running off the rooftops and gurgling through the garden drains. Rain tonight, she said. Julian followed her gaze to the clouds. Heavy by the look of it. Good, we go after dark. The rain will cover our approach through the gardens and keep the patrol guards close to the gatehouse. Nobody walks a perimeter in a downpour if they can avoid it. Julian studied the manor one last time, his eyes tracing the roofline, the chimneys, the windows of the room where he had grown up reading his father's books by the fire. He had been gone 10 years. Tonight, he would walk through his own house as an intruder. After tonight, he said quietly, this ends, one way or another. Clara tucked the notebook into her satchel and stood.
Then let's make sure it ends the right way. They retreated from the cliff edge and returned to the gig, leading the horse deeper into the woodland to wait for darkness. The rain arrived at 8:30, exactly as Clara had predicted. It came in heavy sheets driven sideways by a cold westerly wind, turning the woodland floor into a carpet of mud and flattened leaves. Within 20 minutes, the paths were running with water, and the canopy above offered little protection. Clara pulled her cloak tighter and secured her satchel beneath the oilskin wrapping she had purchased from Mrs. Birch's shop before leaving High Point. Julian crouched beside her at the edge of the tree line, watching the manor through the downpour. The house was a dark shape against a darker sky, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight on the ground floor. The formal gardens below them were invisible in the murk, their walls and pathways swallowed by rain and shadow.
"The gatehouse lamps are still burning,"
Julian said, his voice barely audible beneath the drumming of water on leaves.
"But the perimeter patrol has pulled back. I've been watching for 15 minutes and haven't seen a single guard past the east wall."
Clara wiped rain from her eyes and checked her pocket watch by touch. 9:15. The household staff would be finishing their evening duties, the cook would be banking the kitchen fires, the maids would be turning down beds and drawing curtains in the upper rooms. Within the hour, the servant corridors would be empty, and the house would settle into its nighttime quiet.
"We move now,"
she said. They crossed the open strip of ground between the woodland and the garden wall in less than a minute, keeping low and using the wind-bent shrubs along the boundary as cover. The rain was so heavy that Clara could barely see Julian 3 paces ahead of her. He moved with a sureness that told her his body remembered this ground even after a decade away, his feet finding the solid patches between the puddles as though following a map drawn in his muscles. The service gate on the northeast corner of the garden wall was exactly where Julian had described it. A low wooden door set into the brickwork behind a rotting compost enclosure, its hinges thick with rust and the frame swollen with moisture. Julian gripped the iron handle and pulled. The door resisted for a moment, then gave way with a grinding sound that was thankfully drowned out by the storm. They slipped through the gate into the glasshouse passage. The passage was a narrow gravel path running between the 2 large conservatories, their glass roofs streaming with rain. The air here was warmer, sheltered from the wind by the tall brick walls on either side. Clara could smell damp earth and the faint sweetness of overripe fruit from neglected plants pressing against the clouded glass panels. The conservatories had seen better days. Through the glass, Clara could make out tangled masses of unpruned shrubs, broken clay pots, and wooden benches buried under years of accumulated leaf litter. Whatever care Julian's mother had lavished on these gardens had long since been abandoned. Malachi, it seemed, had no interest in botany. They reached the end of the passage and entered the walled kitchen garden through a stone archway. The garden was a square enclosure roughly 40 yards across, divided into raised planting beds separated by flagstone paths. Most of the beds were overgrown with weeds, though a few near the house wall still showed signs of recent use, probably maintained by the cook for basic herbs and root vegetables. Julian crossed to the far corner, where the potting shed stood against the south wall. The shed was a solid stone structure with a slate roof and a single door hanging slightly open on its upper hinge. He stepped inside and felt along the back wall in the darkness. Clara heard his fingers scraping across stone, searching for the counterweight lever. A dull metallic click echoed inside the shed. Julian emerged and nodded toward a large flagstone set into the ground 3 feet from the shed entrance. "The pin is released," he said. "Help me with the cover." They knelt on either side of the flagstone and lifted. The stone was thick and enormously heavy, but the counterweight mechanism took most of the load, and the cover swung upward on a concealed iron pivot until it rested against the shed wall at a steep angle.
Below, a stone ramp descended into complete darkness. The smell of cold, damp air and old coal dust rose from the opening. Clara struck a match and lit the small tallow candle she had brought in her satchel. The flames sputtered in the draught, then steadied.
The ramp was steep, with worn stone steps cut into the slope, and it dropped about 12 feet to a flagstone floor below. She went first, shielding the candle with her cupped hand, her boots finding each step carefully in the wavering light. The servant cellar at the bottom was a long, low-ceilinged corridor lined with storage alcoves. Wooden racks held dusty wine bottles, stacks of old linen, and crates of household supplies that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. The air was still and cold, and their footsteps echoed softly off the stone walls. Julian took the lead now. He moved through the cellar with quiet confidence, turning left at a junction, passing through a low archway, and following the service corridor as it curved beneath the main body of the house. Clara counted the doorways as they passed. Store cupboard, laundry room, boot room, wine cellar, each one dark and silent. They reached a narrow wooden staircase at the end of the corridor. Julian held up his hand, and they both stood perfectly still, listening. Above them, the house was quiet. The rain hammered against the windows somewhere overhead, and a clock ticked steadily in a distant room. But there were no footsteps, no voices, no sounds of movement. "The butler's pantry is at the top of these stairs, through the door on the left," Julian whispered. "The main staircase to the upper floors is 20 paces beyond that, through the green baize door into the front hall." Clara nodded. "I'll get the keys. You go straight to the library. If the internal doors are unlocked, you won't need to wait for me. If they are locked, stay at the library door and I'll find you." Julian looked at her in the dim candlelight. "If anything goes wrong, if you hear anyone coming, leave through the cellar the way we came in. Don't wait for me." "Let's make sure nothing goes wrong," Clara said. She climbed the stairs first, easing each foot down slowly to test for creaking boards. The door at the top was unlocked. She opened it a few inches and peered through the gap into a dark hallway lit by a single oil lamp turned low on a wall bracket. The butler's pantry door was directly across from her, closed, but with no light showing beneath it. Clara crossed the hallway in 4 quick steps, opened the pantry door, and stepped inside. The room was small and tidy, lined with shelves of polished silverware and folded table linens. The oak dresser stood against the far wall, exactly as Julian had described. She opened the top drawer and found the key ring immediately, a heavy iron ring holding more than a dozen keys of various sizes, each one tagged with a small paper label in careful handwriting. She lifted the ring out, slowly, wrapping her fingers around the keys to keep them from clinking, and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she stepped back into the hallway and moved toward the green baize door, beyond which the grand staircase waited in silence. Somewhere above her, Julian was already climbing toward the library where his family's stolen legacy sat locked inside a wall safe, waiting to be reclaimed. Clara passed through the green baize door into the front hall and found herself standing at the base of a wide oak staircase that rose in a graceful curve toward the upper floors. The hall was grand even in near darkness. A marble-tiled floor stretched toward the main entrance, flanked by tall columns, and hung with portraits in gilded frames that caught the faint light from a single candelabra left burning on the hall table. She climbed the stairs quickly, keeping to the carpeted runner that muffled her footsteps. The first-floor landing opened onto a broad corridor lined with closed doors on both sides. At the far end, a sliver of candlelight spilled from beneath the last door on the right. The library. Clara reached the door and found it standing slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The grand library of Vane Manor was everything Julian had described and more.
It was a double-height room occupying the full width of the east wing, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covering 3 walls and a massive stone fireplace dominating the fourth. A rolling ladder on brass rails leaned against the north shelves, and a pair of leather armchairs flanked a reading table near the windows. The ceiling was painted with a pastoral scene of shepherds and rolling hills, darkened with age but still faintly visible in the light of the single candle Julian had placed on the mantelpiece. Julian stood before the fireplace, looking up at a large oil portrait mounted above the mantel. The painting showed a middle-aged man in a dark frock coat standing beside a writing desk, one hand resting on a stack of leather-bound documents. His face was strong and thoughtful, with the same deep-set eyes Julian carried.
"Your father,"
Clara said quietly.
"Lord Edmund Ashworth," Julian replied. "He sat for this portrait the year before he died. He told me he wanted it hung here so that anyone who entered his library would know that the estate was built on paperwork and patience, not swords and titles." He stepped closer to the portrait and reached for the right side of the heavy gilded frame. His fingers found a small brass catch hidden behind the carved molding. He pressed it, and Clara heard a faint mechanical click somewhere inside the wall. Julian then placed both hands on the lower edge of the frame and lifted it upward on a concealed hinge. The portrait swung away from the wall like a door, revealing a rectangular iron safe set flush into the stonework behind it. The safe was roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, with a flat steel face and a central keyhole surrounded by an engraved border of oak leaves. There was no combination dial, no numbered mechanism, just a single lock that required a single key. Julian turned to Clara. "The key was kept on the butler's ring. It should be the smallest one, made of dark iron with a square bow."
Clara pulled the keyring from her pocket and sorted through the tagged keys until she found the one matching his description. A short, heavy key made of blackened iron, its bow square-cut and its bit worn smooth from years of use. The paper tag attached to it read simply LV in faded ink. Library Vault. She handed it to Julian. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism resisted for a moment, stiff from disuse, then engaged with a deep, satisfying click. Julian pulled the safe door open. Inside, the vault was lined with green felt and divided into 3 compartments. The left compartment held a stack of folded documents tied with a faded blue ribbon. The center compartment contained a leather pouch heavy with coins and a small velvet box. The right compartment held a wooden tray fitted with a hinged lid.
Julian reached for the stack of documents first. He untied the ribbon and unfolded the top sheet, holding it near the candle flame. Clara watched his expression as he read. "This is it," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but something enormous moved beneath the words. "This is the original land charter, drawn up by my father's solicitor in 1830. It names me, Julian Edmund Ashworth, as the sole heir to the Vane estate, its lands, tenancies, and harbour rights, effective upon the death of Lord Edmund Ashworth." He turned the document toward Clara. She examined it carefully. The handwriting was formal and precise, the language dense with legal terminology typical of estate law in this period. At the bottom of the page were 3 signatures: Lord Edmund Ashworth, his solicitor, Mr. Robert Whitfield, and a witness, the Reverend Thomas Ackroyd, vicar of Oakhaven Parish.
"The vicar," Clara said. "Is he still alive?"
"He was when I left England. If he still lives, his testimony would confirm this document's authenticity beyond any challenge."
Clara turned her attention to the right compartment and lifted the hinged lid of the wooden tray. Inside, resting on a bed of cotton wadding, was a small brass cylinder, roughly 3 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. One end was flat and smooth, engraved with a circular design. She lifted it out and held it under the candle. The engraved end bore the seal of a licensed notary. The initials AC were set inside a border of interlocking chain links. Albert Cross. This was the duplicate stamp, the forged mold that had been used to press the false notary seal onto Malachi's fraudulent deed. Clara reached into her satchel and retrieved the linen pouch containing the wax impression she had lifted from the maritime vaults in High Point. She placed the brass mold beside the wax seal on the reading table and held the magnifying lens over both. The match was exact. Every line, every curve, every detail of the engraved design corresponded precisely. And there, running along the inner border of the brass mold, was the casting ridge she had identified 2 days ago. The tiny imperfection created when the duplicate was cast from a clay impression of the original. The same ridge that appeared in the wax seal on Malachi's filed deed.
"This is your proof," Clara said. "The original charter names you as heir. The brass mold proves Malachi manufactured a false notary seal. The harbor logs prove the real notary was out of the country when the forged deed was stamped. And the witness registry at the maritime vaults confirms the 2 witnesses listed on Malachi's filing never existed. Any magistrate presented with all 4 pieces together would have grounds to overturn the estate transfer immediately." Julian gathered the documents and placed them inside his coat. Clara wrapped the brass mold in the cotton wadding and secured it in her satchel alongside the wax impression and her notebook. The velvet box in the center compartment, she noticed, contained a woman's cameo brooch set in silver filigree. Julian glanced at it, touched the lid gently with his fingertips, and closed the safe without taking it.
"My mother's," he said simply. "It stays here. This is still her house."
He closed the portrait back against the wall and pressed the brass catch until it clicked into place. The painted eyes of Lord Edmund Ashworth looked out over the library once more, guarding the empty vault behind him. Clara moved toward the door. "We should leave the way we came, through the cellars and out the garden hatch. If we move quickly, we can be clear of the grounds before the patrol rotation changes." Julian nodded and blew out the candle on the mantelpiece. They stepped into the corridor together, turning toward the staircase, and then a sound came from the darkness ahead of them. A sharp metallic crash, followed by the echo of something heavy rolling across a stone floor. A candlestick, knocked from a hallway table in the adjacent gallery. Julian froze. Clara's hand closed around the strap of her satchel. Footsteps were already moving toward them from somewhere deeper inside the house, accompanied by the low murmur of voices growing louder with every second. Julian pulled Clara sideways through the nearest doorway into a long rectangular room lined with paintings and glass display cabinets. The estate gallery. Moonlight filtered through a row of tall windows on the south wall, casting pale rectangles across the polished floor. The room smelled of furniture wax and old varnish. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the door, listening. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by the glow of a lamp swinging in someone's hand. Clara could hear 2 distinct sets of boots on the corridor floor, walking with the unhurried pace of men who believed they had every right to be there. Julian touched Clara's arm and pointed toward the far end of the gallery, where a second door led to the back staircase. If they moved quickly and quietly, they could reach it before the footsteps arrived at the gallery entrance. They were halfway across the room when the main door swung open behind them. "Stay where you are." The voice was cold and measured, accustomed to giving orders. Clara stopped mid-stride. Julian turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway, holding a brass oil lamp at shoulder height. He was shorter than Julian, thickly built, with a broad face and a carefully trimmed beard going gray at the edges. He wore a quilted dressing gown over a linen shirt, and his feet were in leather house slippers. Behind him stood 2 men in dark coats, house stewards, each carrying a heavy wooden staff. Malachi Ashworth looked at Julian for a long moment. His expression shifted from suspicion to recognition, and then to something harder, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a very long time. "Well," Malachi said, The ghost returns. Julian said nothing.
He stood perfectly still in the center of the gallery, his hands visible at his sides, his face composed. Clara remained 2 paces behind him, her fingers resting on the strap of her satchel. Malachi stepped further into the room, the lamp throwing his shadow in a long diagonal across the floor. The 2 stewards followed, positioning themselves on either side of the doorway. Their staffs were held loosely, ready but not raised. "I heard a rumor last month that you had been seen in Dover," Malachi continued, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "I dismissed it. After 10 years of silence, I assumed you had accepted reality. Found yourself a modest life somewhere on the continent. Perhaps a teaching post or a clerk's position. Something suitable for a man with no estate and no prospects. You know why I'm here," Julian said. Malachi's eyes moved from Julian to Clara, studying her with casual interest. "And who is this? You've brought a companion. How touching. A fellow adventurer, or merely someone foolish enough to follow you into another man's house in the middle of the night?" "My name doesn't concern you," Clara said. Malachi raised an eyebrow. "It will concern the magistrate when I report that 2 trespassers were discovered inside my private residence attempting to steal from the family vault." He glanced toward the corridor behind him. "I assume the library safe has been opened. Mr. Davies, would you go and check?" One of the stewards turned to leave. Julian spoke before the man reached the door. "The safe has been opened, and what I found inside belongs to me." Malachi's expression tightened. "Everything inside this house belongs to me. The deed is filed, the transfer is registered, and the law recognizes my claim. Whatever fantasies you've constructed about stolen inheritances and rightful ownership, they ended 10 years ago when the county court accepted my documentation." "Your documentation," Julian repeated. He reached inside his coat and withdrew the folded land charter. He held it up so that the candlelight from Malachi's lamp fell across the heavy parchment. "This is my father's original estate charter, drawn up by his solicitor in 1830. It names me as sole heir. It carries his signature, the signature of his solicitor, and the witnessed mark of the vicar of Oakhaven Parish." Malachi's face didn't change, but his grip on the lamp handle tightened until his knuckles whitened. Julian held the charter in his left hand and reached into his coat with his right. He produced the brass cylinder wrapped in cotton wadding and held it beside the document. "And this is the forged notary seal you had cast from a clay impression of Albert Cross's licensed mold. The same seal that was stamped onto your fraudulent deed when Albert Cross himself was aboard the merchant vessel Cormorant, somewhere between High Point and Lisbon." The room went very still. The 2 stewards had stopped moving. Their eyes were fixed on the objects in Julian's hands, and their expressions had shifted from professional indifference to something much more attentive. These were household men. They lived and worked on this estate. The question of who rightfully owned it was a matter that touched their own futures directly. Clara stepped forward and opened her notebook. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet gallery to where the stewards stood. "On the 14th of June, 1833, a deed of estate transfer was filed with the Maritime Vaults in High Point by Mr. Malachi Ashworth. The deed listed 2 witnesses, a Mr. George Tull and a Mr. Reginald Fenton. Neither name appears in any High Point resident directory, voter roll, or trade guild register for any year between 1830 and 1836. They are fictitious." She turned a page in the notebook. "The deed was notarized with the seal of Mr. Albert Cross, licensed notary of High Point District. The harbor departure logs for June 1833 confirm that Mr. Cross boarded the merchant vessel Cormorant on the morning of June 13th and did not return to High Point until July 9th. He was physically absent from England on the date his seal was applied to this deed." She held up the linen pouch containing the wax impression from the vaults. "This is the wax impression lifted from the filed deed at the Maritime Vaults.
The brass mold in Mr. Ashworth's hand bears an identical casting ridge along the inner border, a manufacturing defect consistent with a secondary mold cast from clay rather than the original licensed stamp. The two match exactly. The stewards were listening to every word. The older of the two, a grey-haired man with deep lines around his mouth, looked from Clara to Julian to the documents in their hands. Then he looked at Malachi. Malachi's composure had held throughout Clara's account, but the color had drained steadily from his face. He set the lamp down on the nearest display cabinet with a controlled hand. "This proves nothing," he said. "You've broken into my home, opened my private safe, and stolen documents that are my property. Any evidence obtained through burglary will be dismissed by any court in England." "Perhaps," Julian said, "but the harbour departure logs are public record. The witness directories are public record. The filing at the maritime vaults is public record. Every piece of evidence Miss Thorne has described can be verified independently by any magistrate who chooses to examine them. The only item that cannot be found in a public archive is this brass mold, which sat inside a safe in your own library." Malachi opened his mouth to respond, but the older steward spoke first. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, addressing Malachi with a careful formality that carried a new weight, "I think it would be wise to wait for the magistrate before any further discussion takes place." The hours between the confrontation in the gallery and the arrival of dawn passed in a strange, suspended silence. Malachi retreated to his private study on the ground floor and locked the door behind him. The two stewards remained in the gallery with Julian and Clara, though the atmosphere had shifted considerably since the older steward's intervention. The staffs had been set down against the wall, and someone had brought a pot of tea from the kitchen without being asked. Clara sat at the long table beneath the gallery windows, her notebook and evidence laid out before her in neat order. Julian stood near the fireplace, his arms folded, watching the corridor for any sign of movement from Malachi's direction. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle outside, and the first grey light of morning was beginning to soften the darkness beyond the glass. The older steward, whose name was Mr. Hobson, had served the Vane estate for nearly 30 years. He had been a footman under Lord Edmund, promoted to house steward 3 years after Malachi's arrival. He said little during those long hours, but what he did say carried the weight of a man who had been carrying private doubts for a very long time. "There were questions when the transfer happened," Hobson said at one point, standing near the door with his hands clasped behind his back. "Among the staff, I mean. Lord Edmund had spoken openly about his son inheriting the estate. Everyone in the household knew the arrangement. When Mr. Malachi arrived with the deed and the young master never appeared to challenge it, most of us assumed there had been a change of heart, a family matter settled privately." "There was no change of heart," Julian said. "I was in Edinburgh when my father died. By the time I reached Oakhaven, Malachi had already filed the deed and installed himself as master. I spent 2 years trying to contest the transfer through solicitors in London, and every one of them told me the same thing. Without access to the original charter, and without proof that the filed deed was fraudulent, I had no standing." Hobson nodded slowly. "And so you left the country?" "I had no choice. Malachi made it clear through intermediaries that if I continued pressing my claim, he would bring charges of harassment and defamation against me. I went to France, then to the Low Countries. I worked as a private tutor and a bookkeeper for English merchants abroad. Every year, I wrote to my father's former solicitor, asking for any new development. Every year, the answer was the same." Clara looked up from her notes. "What changed? You said you received word recently that Malachi was preparing to sell parts of the estate." "A letter reached me in Brussels 6 weeks ago," Julian said, "from a friend who still lives in the district. He wrote that Malachi had been meeting with a railway surveyor and a group of investors from London. They want to run a branch line through the southern portion of the estate, cutting across the river meadows and the tenant farmland. If Malachi signs those contracts, The land transfers become permanent, regardless of any future ownership dispute. The railway company would hold legal title to those parcels, and no court would unwind a completed commercial transaction of that scale. "When are the contracts expected to be signed?" Hobson asked. "Within the week, according to my friend's letter. That's why I came back now. There was no more time to wait for solicitors and legal channels." The clock in the hallway struck 6. Clara gathered her evidence into her satchel and stood up from the table. The message she needed to have delivered had already been sent. On their last afternoon in High Point, she had written a formal letter addressed to the High District Magistrate, Sir William Greyburn, outlining the nature of the evidence they had uncovered and requesting an inspection of the estate filing records. She had entrusted the letter to a commercial carriage driver who ran a regular overnight service between High Point and the county seat, paying him a full sovereign to ensure delivery before morning. If the letter had arrived on schedule, the magistrate would have received it at his offices by dawn. By 9:30, the rain had stopped entirely, and a watery sun was breaking through the clouds above the valley. Clara stood at the gallery window and watched the main drive below. The lime trees lining the gravel approach were dripping steadily, and the gatehouse guards had resumed their positions, though they looked uncertain. Word of the night's events had clearly reached them, and their employer's authority was no longer the solid ground it had been 12 hours earlier. At 9:45, a carriage appeared at the end of the drive. It was a black brougham with polished brass fittings, drawn by a matched pair of bay horses. Behind it rode 2 men on horseback wearing the dark blue coats and silver buttons of the county legal office. The carriage passed through the gates without stopping and pulled up at the front entrance of the manor. Clara turned from the window.
"He's here."
Julian straightened his coat and walked to the main staircase. Clara followed, her satchel over her shoulder. Hobson accompanied them, his presence a quiet signal to the rest of the household that what was about to happen carried his endorsement. The front door was opened by the younger steward, Mr. Davies, who had spent the last hour hovering in the entrance hall with the expression of a man trying to determine which side of a shifting situation he should be standing on. Sir William Greyburn stepped inside, removing his hat and gloves and handing them to Davies with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to entering other people's houses on official business. The magistrate was in his early 60s, tall and spare, with a long face and sharp blue eyes beneath heavy brows. He wore a dark frock coat over a grey waistcoat, and he carried a leather document case under his arm. His manner was formal but unhurried. He had been presiding over county legal matters for more than 20 years, and he approached every case with the same methodical patience. "I received a letter yesterday evening," Sir William said, addressing the room at large, "from a Miss Thorne, describing certain irregularities in an estate filing registered with the Maritime Vaults in High Point in June of 1833. I have brought copies of the relevant registry entries from my own office for comparison." He turned to Julian. "You are the claimant, Mr. Julian Ashworth?" "I am, Sir William." "And the respondent, Mr. Malachi Ashworth?" The study door at the end of the hall opened. Malachi emerged, dressed now in a formal morning coat with a high collar and a dark cravat. He had composed himself during the night, and his expression was controlled and businesslike. He crossed the hall and stood opposite Julian, facing the magistrate. "I am Malachi Ashworth," he said, "and I wish to state for the record that these individuals entered my home without permission, opened my private safe, and removed documents that are the property of this estate." Sir William regarded him calmly. "The question of how the evidence was obtained is a matter for the court to consider in due course. My concern this morning is whether the evidence itself has merit. Miss Thorne, I understand you have prepared a summary of the relevant findings." Clara stepped forward, opened her satchel, and laid out the original land charter, the brass mold, the wax impression from the Maritime Vaults, and her notebook containing the harbor departure records and witness directory searches. Sir William set his document case on the whole table, opened it, and placed his own copies of the estate filing beside Clara's evidence. The examination took less than 30 minutes. The magistrate compared the documents line by line, cross-referencing the witness names against the directory records Clara had compiled. He held the brass mold beside the wax impression and studied the casting ridge through a pocket lens of his own. He read the harbour departure entry for the cormorant and noted the date against the filing date on Malachi's deed. When he finished, he closed his document case and stood upright. The evidence presented is sufficient to warrant a formal investigation and an immediate suspension of all property transactions associated with the Vane estate, pending judicial review. He turned to Malachi. Mr. Ashworth, you will accompany my officers to the county seat, where you will be held to answer charges of document fraud, forgery of a notary seal, and unlawful seizure of an estate through deception. The Great Hall of Vane Manor had not been used for a formal assembly in over a decade. Its oak-paneled walls and high vaulted ceiling were built for occasions of weight and ceremony, the kind of gatherings where tenants, staff, and local officials came together under one roof to witness the business of the estate conducted in the open. Lord Edmund had held quarterly councils here, seated at the long table on the raised platform at the north end of the room, hearing grievances, settling boundary disputes, and reviewing the accounts of every farm and holding under his authority. On this afternoon, the hall was full again. Word had travelled quickly through the parish. By noon, tenant farmers had begun arriving on foot and by cart from every corner of the estate. The village shopkeepers closed early. The innkeeper at the barley sheaf locked his doors and walked the 3 miles to the manor with his wife and his eldest son. The Reverend Thomas Ackroyd, now in his late 70s and walking with the aid of a carved oak stick, was brought by pony trap from the vicarage and given a chair near the front of the hall. Sir William Greyburn had remained at the manor throughout the morning to oversee the legal formalities. His 2 officers had departed at first light, with Malachi seated between them in the magistrate's carriage, his wrists unbound, but his authority thoroughly finished. Malachi had said nothing as he crossed the courtyard. He had looked back once at the manor's front facade, and then the carriage door had closed, and he was gone. The estate council was convened at 2 o'clock. Sir William stood at the head of the long table and addressed the assembled room with the measured tone of a man reading history into the record. On this day, the 6th of October, 1843, following an examination of evidence presented to this office, the estate transfer registered with the Maritime Vaults of High Point on the 14th of June, 1833, naming Mr. Malachi Ashworth as heir and master of the Vane estate, has been declared fraudulent and void. The original land charter, drawn up by the late Lord Edmund Ashworth in 1830, naming his son Mr. Julian Edmund Ashworth as sole heir, has been verified and restored to full legal standing. He paused and looked toward Julian, who stood at the side of the hall near the tall windows. Julian was dressed in a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit across the shoulders, his traveling clothes having been the only garments he had carried with him from the continent. His beard was untrimmed, and his boots were still caked with mud from the previous night's journey through the gardens. He looked nothing like a duke taking possession of a great estate. He looked like a man who had walked a very long road and had only just realized he had reached the end of it. "Mr. Ashworth," Sir William said, "will you come forward?" Julian crossed the hall. The room was silent except for the sound of his boots on the stone floor. He reached the table and stood facing the magistrate. Sir William placed the original charter on the table between them, alongside a fresh document bearing the county seal. "By the authority vested in me as High District Magistrate of this county, I hereby reinstate Mr. Julian Edmund Ashworth as the rightful Duke of Vane Manor and all associated lands, tenancies, and harbour rights, in accordance with the wishes of his late father, Lord Edmund Ashworth." Julian signed the restoration document with a steady hand. The Reverend Ackroyd was helped to his feet by 2 younger men and came forward to witness the signature, adding his own mark below Julian's with the same pen he had used to witness the original charter 13 years earlier. His hand trembled, but the letters were clear. A murmur passed through the hall. Then someone near the back began to clap, and within moments the entire room had joined in. Farmers who remembered Lord Edmund, servants who had watched Malachi's tenure with quiet unease, shopkeepers who had felt the slow erosion of fair dealing and honest management that had characterized the estate under its false master. The applause was not loud or dramatic. It was the sound of relief, the kind that comes when something crooked is finally set straight. Julian stood at the table and let the sound wash over him. He did not smile or raise his hand or make any gesture of triumph.
He simply stood there, looking out across the faces of people whose lives were tied to this land as deeply as his own. And he let the moment settle into the walls of the hall where his father had once stood in exactly the same place. When the room grew quiet again, Julian spoke. "I owe this restoration to many people. To Sir William, whose diligence and fairness made the legal process possible on such short notice. To the Reverend Ackroyd, whose willingness to bear witness today completes a circle that began 13 years ago. To Mr. Hobson and the household staff, who kept this estate standing through years of uncertain stewardship." He paused and turned toward the side of the hall where Clara stood near the door, her satchel over her shoulder, her notebook still tucked under her arm. She had positioned herself at the edge of the gathering, apart from the main assembly, as though she considered her role in the proceedings to be finished.
"And most of all," Julian said, "to Miss Clara Thorne of Oakhaven Parish. 4 nights ago, on a dark road in the pouring rain, she risked her own safety to stop a stranger's carriage from crossing a broken bridge. She had no idea who I was. She had no reason to involve herself further. She could have ridden home, gone to sleep, and returned to her work the following morning without a second thought. Instead, she chose to help. She identified the origin of the forged documents. She gained access to the public archives in High Point. She proved that the notary seal was counterfeit. She found a way into this manor when every gate was guarded. She stood in the gallery at midnight and laid out the evidence so clearly that 2 house stewards and a magistrate could follow the trail without a single gap. Every piece of proof that made today possible passed through her hands." He looked directly at Clara. "Miss Thorne, I would like to offer you the official post of head administrator and estate keeper of the Vane Duchy. The position carries a full salary, private quarters within the manor, and complete authority over the management of the estate's records, accounts, and correspondence. You would answer to no one except me, and on matters of administration, your word would be final." The room turned to look at Clara. She stood very still for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she walked forward through the assembled tenants and staff until she reached the long table. She set her satchel down on the oak surface, beside the charter and the restoration document and the county seal, and she looked at Julian with the same steady, practical gaze she had given him on the road 4 nights earlier, when he had been a stranger standing in the rain beside a broken carriage. "I accept," she said. Julian extended his hand. Clara shook it. And somewhere in the room, old Reverend Ackroyd was seen to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, though he would later insist it was nothing more than dust from the rafters. The great hall emptied slowly over the course of the afternoon. Tenants lingered to speak with Julian individually, some offering congratulations, others bringing long-deferred complaints about drainage ditches and fence repairs that had gone unaddressed for years. Clara listened to each one, making notes in her book, already cataloging the work that lay ahead. By evening, the hall was quiet. The candles had been lit in the library upstairs, and the fire had been laid fresh in the grate beneath Lord Edmund's portrait. Julian sat in one of the leather armchairs with the original charter spread across his knees, reading his father's words for the second time. Clara sat at the reading table across from him, A fresh ledger opened before her, beginning the first page of what would become the most meticulous estate record in the county. Outside, the sun was setting over the river valley, painting the stone walls of Vane Manor in shades of amber and gold. The bridge on the old road was still broken, its arch fractured and its keystones missing. But repairs had already been ordered, and by the end of the week, the stones would be set right again. Some things, once restored, hold stronger than before.